All right. Greetings, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where in the world you are at this moment, or whether you might be watching this recording afterwards. So, good day to everyone. My name is Megan Tinsley, and I'm Senior Lecturer in Sociology at the University of Manchester. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this panel on decolonizing international collaborations, hosted by the Decolonising Knowledges Working Group of the Global Humanities Alliance. The Global Humanities Alliance is a collaboration between 8 founding universities thus far on 6 continents. Its mission is to raise the profile, social, and political impact of the humanities and social sciences through an emphasis on research and teaching that takes up global issues, incorporates diverse global perspectives, and brings scholars and students together for critical conversations. A core value of the GHA is that by combining our complementary and distinctive strengths, we can better address key global challenges and showcase the difference humanities, social sciences, and liberal arts make to the world. One important way we do that is through our working groups, which meet regularly online, drawing together staff from all 8 universities to initiate collaborations and plan events. The Working Group on Decolonizing Knowledges aims to challenge colonial epistemologies and cultivate diverse ways of knowing. And it is the structural and institutional facets of that theme that we will be discussing in today's panel. There's a fundamental tension at the core of international academic collaborations. Universities are crucial sites for thinking critically, incubating radical social movements, and challenging oppressive systems of power, as well as drawing people together across socially salient boundaries. At the same time, they're elite spaces that create and maintain colonial knowledges, as well as police who has access to them. This tension often comes to a head in international collaborations, as critical scholars navigate skeptical or even hostile structures, ranging from ethics applications and risk assessments to funding bodies and publishers. The result is that collaborations that trumpet their commitments to decolonization often end up reinforcing the very oppressive dynamics that they claim to challenge. So I'm joined today by 5 panelists who bring with them a wealth of experience navigating the good and the bad of international collaborations. I'll introduce each of them in turn as they speak. The format of the event is going to be a roundtable that I hope will be conducive to discussion. Each panelist is going to speak for about 10 minutes, drawing from their own experience. And then I'll invite the audience and the panelists to pose questions and share reflections as we aim to learn from each other. As a reminder, this event is being recorded. So if you'd like to ask a question but you don't want to be recorded, then feel free to type it in the chat. So with that, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Mjiba Frehiwot. Dr. Mjiba Frehiwot is a senior research fellow at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana, where her research interests include Pan-African political thought, African diaspora, cultural and political identity, decolonization of knowledge production, and race and identity in the African diaspora. She has significant experience with international collaborations as a journal editor and a principal investigator, as well as, I think it's fair to say, a key figure in the African Studies Association of Africa. So I will hand it over to you, Dr. Mjiba. I'm looking forward to your contribution.
Thank you, Megan. And I hope my sound is fine. Okay, perfect. So I'm in a bit of a noisy place. So if you see any background noise or perhaps someone walking behind me, don't be alarmed. Okay. So I'm happy to be here. And I am, when I think about this discussion around international institutional collaborations and decolonization, a couple of things come to mind. I think 3 major things come to mind, right? The first thing that comes to mind is the possibilities of international institutional collaborations and how they can disrupt, right? So they can certainly disrupt power asymmetries. They can disrupt the colonial library and the colonial apparatus, and in many cases, sort of this neo-colonial education or international, so-called international education, as we're trying to peg it as these days. So that's one thing. It can really be disruptive, right? It can also reinforce the status quo. It reinforces this, and I'll take each one of these um, bit by bit, but it can reinforce the status quo of global North and global South higher education institutions, as well as academics and students, etc. Right? Really, it can reinforce a colonial relationship between the core and the periphery, right? And then the third thing that it can do is it can potentially build alternative institutions outside of what we know as higher education or decolonized international institutions. And I hope there's no noise because some people are chatting loudly. But so the first, and I want to actually start in the middle because I think that's probably the piece that's the core of this conversation. For me, international collaborations oftentimes reinforce the colonial relationship between, Europe and America, and in my case, Africa, right, or Ghana. Often I have had instances where I have been in international collaborations and I was told point blank that no one outside of Europe can be a PI, right? Later to find out that that's not true. I have engaged with PIs and funders, and there's a real paternalism, right, that comes along with this question of collaborations. I've also, as a matter of fact, at this current juncture, there's someone who reached out to me several years ago for a project. They needed a collaborator in order to get this, a grant, for example, in the UK, and I've not heard back from them. And now they're scrambling, trying to see how many ever £1,000 can be spent now, right? And have the expectation that I would be so excited to jump up and get a few £1,000 or a free trip to Europe, right? And then I think that, but I think what's more insidious than sort of the replication of these power asymmetries, in practice is the ideological and the replications and the production of knowledge and a colonial relationship when it comes to production of knowledge, right? So for example, when you think and also the class differential between those academics and students and whoever who happen to be employed in the global north versus those of us on the continent, right? So for me, I think that's more significant than someone saying, "Oh, you can't be a PI," or not giving enough funds, or saying you should jubilate to get an airline ticket to wherever, right? And I think that's more insidious because it becomes not a one-off problem with this particular project that MG Ben whoever had, but it's really a mentality which drives someone's academic career, right? And what it does is it does two things. It elevates and normalizes a colonial relationship between academics and universities in the global north, Europe, America, Germany, wherever, wherever we want to say, the UK, France, and in some cases China or other places in the east, right? And in my case Africa, right? And so it normalizes that. And so what happens with that normalization is that academics and researchers from those spaces, whether you're African, European, Asian, Latinx, no matter your gender, no matter your ethnic background, no matter where you were born, there is a particular colonial understanding about your role and responsibility towards those of us who are in the so-called global south, right? So that's one. And I think we also have to be honest about those of us who are in the global south, right? Sometimes that normal what that what that normalizing of this colonial relationship does is that it also makes it normal for me, the person in the global south, again, no matter your gender, no matter your race, no matter your ethnicity, right, to accept, right, this colonial relationship because because I don't have any research funds, because I have very little access to research dollars, because of this, promotion, publish or perish mentality and so-called international education that's sweeping the globe, right? I'm forced to publish, and I'm just using Megan as the person. This is not the relationship with Megan, but I'm forced to publish with Megan no matter the relationship, right? Because I need that one publication to put in my promotion packet, right? And so what it does is it normalizes, quite frankly, abusive and exploitative behavior from the individual as well as the institution. And for me, that relationship, which is philosophical, it's ideological, and it's also practical, is really the most detrimental part of the challenges around. Let me look at my do I only have, I think I have 2 minutes left. Jesus. Okay, let me quickly move because I put on my timer. So that for me, I think is a really central thing. And I'll quickly talk about the other two. I think I think in order for us to kind of think about how to disrupt this middle piece, it's important for us to begin to view one another as human beings, and also to recognize that power is not necessarily tied to geographical location, right? And power is also and should not be tied to one's university's endowment, right? And or we need to begin to disrupt the colonial relationship between our universities, right? Which of course we know was a holdover from the colonial era. That's number one. And then two, I think we need to push back against the colonial library, right? Because oftentimes we'll say in fields, and no shade to like sociology and history and whatever and political science, but oftentimes when we're teaching these courses, we start, you know, in Europe as if there was nothing happening in the rest of the world. And we only bring in one or two people who are of African, Latin, Asian descent, right? And so I think for me, and as we get into the conversation, we'll talk more about this question of disruption. But I think for me, our job at this particular juncture is to disrupt these international collaborations and make them equitable, but not just equitable, right? Like not equality, but if we know that there are colonial disadvantages and colonial advantages, we need to make sure that they actually are equitable, regardless of one's geographic location, regardless of one's class, regardless of one's, where in the world their universities place, what international rankings they are. And I'll stop here after I say this. And it kind of may or may not set me back when it comes to questions of promotion or whatever, but I am 90% of my publications, I publish in open access journals and and if I can, books. And that's because knowledge should not be put behind paywalls. And this is the way in which we equalize this colonial relationship, and we begin to decolonize international institutional collaborations. Thank you so much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much for that, Jiva. There are already so many interesting complexities arising from what you've said, problematizing binaries, looking at the relationship between interpersonal dynamics and institutional relationships and the way that changes or doesn't change over the course of a research collaboration. So looking forward to returning to those themes as we continue the discussion. So next, I'm going to invite Professor Winnie Matula to speak. Professor Christopher Asike is hoping to join us a bit later. He unfortunately is held up in a meeting that he cannot leave. I'm sure we've all been there before, but he is hoping to join us later in the discussion. Professor Winnie Matula is a research professor of development studies at the Institute for Development Studies of the University of Nairobi. Her research on the provision and management of urban services has spanned the public and nonprofit sectors, including many collaborations with UN and government agencies, as well as international NGOs. Professor Matula is also a member of the steering committee of the Global Humanities Alliance, as well as a member of the Decolonising Knowledges Working Group. So welcome, Professor Matula, and looking forward to your contribution.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mjimba, for really opening it up with very key issues, which I will not repeat, but I'll keep cross-referencing them. Indeed, international collaborations are common in most of our continents. And of course, another point, as she has highlighted, is that they are skewed. But in literature, you tend to find the skewedness is attached to Eurocentric, American-centric, but I think there are so many centrics beyond the two centrics. Even looking at Far East, we begin to see some of that. So it's also good for us as we continue to discuss to acknowledge that as much as literature emphasizes the original colonial, entities, it's now a different ballgame, and we have to expand that conceptualization. Again, there is a lot of, the criticism on this topic is really embedded in the need to decolonize. And I just want to at least reflect on, quote some two authors that ground a discussion in a way that I really admire. Maya Perry et al., that says partnerships begin on the basis of histories, understandings, and layers of context that are not always directly connected to you, but always influencing the starting positions and potentials of collaborations ahead. That's quite what I think Mujiba is also telling us. And then there is also Walter Minolo and Walsh, who says that we speak from particular location in power structures, be it north or south. No one escapes the class, sexual, gender, spiritual, linguistic, geographical, and racial hierarchies of modern capitalist and patriarchal world system. And I like that Minolo's position because we have skewedness across in the current world. So as much as we know that the intensity of it lies in being Eurocentric, there are other layers. So I would mention some 3 areas or so before I go into the last part of how can we then start looking at it in a fresh way, or what do we change? The issue of awareness and sensitivity of knowledge production, I think, is critical in this discussion. If we look at efforts that are trying to address the topic, I mean, like even the charter, for example, the African Charter for Transformative Research Collaborations, of course, it calls on decentering and ensuring that we become aware of these Eurocentric epistemic orientations. But also there is this issue of the different epistemic communities. And sometimes when we talk about indigenous, referring to how our orientation, I know that this concept indigenous is very contentious, and there are scholars who don't want it. But there is also European knowledge, there is other knowledges, but I think what affects us and is related to this, our looking at international collaborations, is the discourses that inform what we do. And to a large extent, we can unearth them, and they may be skewed towards different contexts, different geographies. But then at the end of the day, the one that informs most of what we do is the concern that we are raising. For example, the many collaborations that we have across the globe, some with European countries or European Union, some with American, some with the Far East. So a lot of different perspectives. But then decolonizing this knowledge, hegemonic knowledge that we have, the so-called global knowledge, requires restructuring basically, as we need to look at the structures, we need to look at social and even economic power, because the economic power is very critical. And when we talk about looking at the economic power, then we want to look at like the structures. What are the structures, in my experience, with collaborations? I think the in structures are not supportive, not just the North structures or the Far East or West structures, but even the structures in our own context in Africa are not conducive, because you see, you have the institutional structures that support research, for example. Then you find that your own institution may not support you in the same manner that an institution in the West or Far East might support research. And then, of course, with that comes issues like, for example, contracting for research, comes issues of due diligence. And the issue is they may be skewed. Like, for example, due diligence is very skewed. Due diligence almost assumes that the South has a problem. Is the same premise. If you read Gachani Ndolovu, who talks about the lacks and deficits. So it's like the South has a problem already. So when you do due diligence, you are expecting to find problems. And sometimes you find that you have been engaging with a particular collaborator. So you wonder, why should we do due diligence when we are already collaborating? And already you have done another due diligence. That then complicates the whole thing about engagement with partners. Of course, even the ethics approvals, if we look at things like ethics, again, the ethics don't go deep into the things that haunt us or bother us, things like the role of partners, researchers, positionality. It doesn't get into that. Equitable access to several other things that make research work better. And then, of course, that usually brings a lot of problems along the way. So in general, when you look at issue of economic and social power, you find is skewed. Partnerships are skewed, especially in many ways. In funding, I won't talk all, but I'll pick a few to express the details. Funding, agenda setting, proposal writing, lead researchers, publications, and impact, and resource disbursement. And I think Mujiba has talked a lot to that. You find that there is always minimal institutional overheads for global South institutions. I engage with my partners and push and shove about a 10% or a 5-7%. But I know that in the North, people have even up to 30% institutional overhead. But what I want to note is that is those resources that can then build the ecosystem, the infrastructure that one requires to do research. If the South had the privilege of having those kind of, better institutional overhead, it would be better. Of course, agenda setting, we can say agenda setting is largely latched onto the global, not global North, because most of the agenda that is on SDG, which even the South have signed to. But if you look deeply, the question is, the prevailing current focus, is it the one that I need in Kenya or somebody needs in Ghana or South Africa? Maybe not. Right now, there is a lot of money on climate, but probably some context that is not a priority. So agenda setting makes us fall prey to keep now focusing on that particular area. Sometimes back, it was equity and poverty. Now it's shifting. Same with the proposal writing. A lot of support elsewhere to write a proposal. In the South, is more of an assumption that if you are a scholar, you will write that proposal and all its components, including doing the budget. So we are really jack of all trades. Let me just go to the last part, which is the practical approaches that I think can help this reciprocal partnership, which we value a lot and we will continue engaging with, but we need to sort it out to address structural, economic, and social barriers. One is that I think the Global South needs to invest in research to disrupt the skewed partnerships. We have to put more resources. As much as I'm arguing that we need institutional overhead to increase, the South needs to budget for research. That's the only way we will crack the power play that is embedded. Again, that will help in supporting infrastructure and even administration of research if we put some budget of it. And of course, if we increase the percentage in terms of the budgets that countries have put, and then of course there is also the issue of institutional overhead, which we need to improve on, and then redistributing power, definitely, in the projects that we are engaged in. We need to be sensitive to it so that we can see power redistribution across. Because even when we look at the BRICS, the Brazils, Russia, India, and China, even those, they are having their own problems of skewedness and power. So this power is not just being Eurocentric. Of course, issue of contracting and due diligence is something to look into. And then last two is really, we need to continue creating awareness and sensitization of researchers on use of decolonization lens in development, operationalization and governance of partnerships. And last but not least, we need to continue building equitable partnerships that respect epistemic communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Winnie. I'm glad that you've begun to delve into the details of what practically institutional collaborations look like and what systems are involved, especially these questions of the relationship between complex abstract power dynamics, positionality, and then the practicalities of due diligence, ethics, administrative overhead. And these questions of particular systems are very much within the wheelhouse of our next speaker, Dr. Chegofatso Siabi, who I will introduce now. Dr. Chegofatso Siabi is a research facilitator in the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Manchester, where she oversees research funding applications and advises staff who want to undertake international collaborations. She holds a PhD in public health from Wits University in South Africa. Dr. Siabi is currently the principal investigator of the British Academy-funded project Equitable Partnerships for African Research Infrastructure and Capacity. So we're looking forward to hearing her reflections on these themes. So welcome, Dr. Siabi. I'm looking forward to your contribution.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And as Megan introduced, because I come from a research development, research management side of it, I am here to slightly offer a different perspective to a researcher's view. So I think a lot of the challenges that around colonial power dynamics have been highlighted, some that I would have spoken about by Majiwa and Winnie. And I'll just start off by saying, I think that coming from a research management perspective, I will say that a lot of our funding schemes are centralized decision-making in the global north or global, which often, as Winnie mentioned, dictates what the priorities are and what methodologies and designs look like. And these often don't always reflect international priorities in the international context. There's often challenges and circumstances that I see in terms of quick turnarounds around grant deadlines. And often, as has mentioned, there's a lot of support in our institutions for this responsive mode to grant applications that often has the inclusion of international researchers, but not necessarily meaningfully in sort of discussing the design or even decision making around what the priorities of the project can be. And often this is for a variety of reasons, and the circumstances that come through my desk are often around the deadlines. Grant systems often favor global north institutions in terms of strong administrative capacities. So from roles like mine, which are really to work with researchers to turn great ideas into funded projects by spotting these opportunities as they're coming, or if they're even pre-announced, to building these partnerships and navigating the funding landscape in a way that ensures that the academics can be responsive to the grants that isn't always reflective in Africa, where I'm currently working with partners, but obviously in other international contexts. And that creates obviously a different kind of power dynamic as well. Winnie just mentioned institutional structures around compliance frameworks and risk assessments, often assuming Western norms. And often in my experiences, I've seen they sideline local realities. Winnie gave an example of due diligence requirements. So often we have long-standing partnerships that often due diligence has to keep on happening for various ways. Very difficult to have those conversations about the reasons in which these due diligence have to happen and the assumptions around those as well. A different aspect of it is that it often assumes that everything should be in English, which is the predominant language, which is so different to, or even neglects the fact that not all countries have English as the form of communication or even formal language. And so a lot of these documents that are required will often need translation and notarization, which often causes quite a lot of delays, which compromises a lot of the timing of the project, but also the international partnerships itself. Having the experience of both leading some work with research managers, but also working with researchers, I found that while in an institution like Manchester, there is often researchers like Megan and research development like me working together in developing some of these work in the Global South, in particular in the countries that I'm currently collaborating with. As Winnie mentioned, researchers are also doing the work of research management, and often that creates a lot of time constraints. So they're juggling more than just one thing all at the same time. And so even the discussions around where resources lie or institutional overheads and budgeting and all of that stuff often lands on researchers. And the communication between research management professionals on our side and the lack of understanding historically on what's going on in the Global South often causes misunderstandings and often leads to a lot of misalignment in what goes into grants, at least in my experience. What we're learning, I suppose, is also a lot of needs around what researchers are able to do, what kind of infrastructures are there in terms of research management, and how they exist or not exist or in what form. I think the assumption has always been because we have research management infrastructure, there has to be an equivalent on the other side. And obviously, with all these conversations, we're learning that's not always the case. And that often causes a lot of misalignment, but also the power dynamics about who advocates and how these resources and funding opportunities come about changes in terms of that. But I will say that having been working in this area for a long time, there is a lot of change that I think the direction of travel can be positive. From funders particularly, I think the direction of travel is that funders are looking for more meaningful engagement in collaborations. So they need to show that work programs in any funded work is co-created and that the research project accounts for local partners, but also ensuring relevance to the local community needs. I think that's coming. And that's because there's quite a shift around embedding impact from the very beginning, which means that you have to have very clear plans and pathways from the very beginning in terms of how you are aligning. And that's from the research team itself in terms of the balance of the partners, but also in terms of publications, who leads, who doesn't, but also the local societal impact. And I'm happy to discuss those even more. There definitely have been, more recently, Megan mentioned that I'm leading a British Academy funded project that is recognizing the critical skill of research management in working with researchers to sort of align all of this. My main job is to look at what funders are looking for and align the work that researchers are doing to that particular thing. So there isn't any assumption that you're only doing the proposal all on your own, but it is to say that you've got support in various different ways. And I think that that's been recognized as an important thing to enable a research environment where there is a balance and there is a lot of support for researchers working both locally, regionally, but across the globe as well. And this part of the project by the British Academy is one of them, but I'm sure there'll be others as well. Funders like Wellcome Trust and the National Institute of Health Research is moving to a place where they allow Global South investigators to be project leads without having UK partners, or etc. And this supports a shift, in terms of local research agendas and placing importance. I know indigenous is a contentious word, but indigenous knowledge, knowledge systems that are really important and should be acknowledged in that instance. There are several other things I think that are coming, I think, as a positive shift change to research infrastructure from a research management perspective. And just to close off, I do want to say that I think that there needs to be an acknowledgement, at least from our side, that there is a privilege to having research management support in the way that it is, but also ensure that even as we are working as research managers with other global partners, that we ensure that resources are allocated reflecting the needs of the research design, and often that sits in the global south, and that, where possible, there needs to be built-in capacity building that will balance out the power dynamics as well. So true equity in research collaborations is going to require all of us to be intentional and transparent and willing to challenge some of these systems, I think, as we're working together. And so I see a lot of potential for change coming from funders, but also institutions. And I think researchers on this panel obviously alike. So good intentions are not always enough. And I think we talk about that quite a lot, and these exist and I'm sure will continue to exist. I think we need to have the willingness to find opportunities to better support these efficiencies and push the systems as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shego. It's encouraging to hear that funding bodies and institutions are beginning to respond to the demand for change, but it's also a helpful reminder that that only comes from pushing from people within and outside of institutions in the global north and south, pushing for greater inclusion. So that's a helpful reminder, I think, to all of us. I'm also glad you raised the issue of language and English language hegemony in academia. It's worth mentioning now that one of our partner universities in the Global Humanities Alliance, the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, I think Alison Rame from PUCC is here on this call, but they were hoping to have a speaker join this panel. But because of the language barrier, because the relevant experts within PUCC were not entirely comfortable presenting in English, that means that we're not able to have that voice on this panel. So I do hope that if there are PUCC members on this call, they're able to join. But it is a reminder for all of us, even within collaborations like the GHA, to think critically about English language hegemony and how to be more inclusive of a wider range of languages and all the knowledges that those bring to the conversation. So next I will invite Professor Andrea Zevnik to speak. Professor Zevnik is Professor of Critical Global Politics at the University of Manchester. Her main areas of research expertise fall at the intersection of political violence, politics of protest and political action, psychoanalysis and post-colonial theory, and critical race theory. She's also a member of the GHA Decolonising Knowledges Working Group, and she was previously the lead for internationalization at the School of Social Sciences at the University of Manchester. So she brings all of those experiences to the conversation. So welcome, Professor Zevnik. Looking forward to your contribution.
Thank you, Megan. Right, so the contribution, the way I imagine this contribution is really to follow, the questions, Megan, that you've shared with us. And in particular focus on the project that we did together. So the project that Megan was also co-leading, as well as our colleague Tony Hastrup, and partners that Majiba and Chris, and then also our colleagues at the University of Nairobi at the Department of Education, the Faculty of Education. So as part of that project, we were looking at we were looking at decolonial knowledge production in higher education, and specifically focusing on teaching, research, and also international collaborations. We focus on how decolonial kind of commitments can help us rethink international collaborations and rethink what equity in research partnership perhaps might mean. Decolonial Praxis project kind of finished earlier this year. And kind of some of the outputs are also kind of a toolkit and guidelines which I will be drawing on a little bit today as we are, as you know, throughout this presentation. So, you know, Megan, you asked us, you know, if global or if the collaborations or international institutional collaborations risk replicating colonial power dynamics. And I think, as all the speakers so far have said, you know, I think this is almost inevitable, right? And it's almost inevitable from a number of reasons. The first one, and I guess the most obvious one, is of course that universities are colonial institutions, are colonial projects. You know, they are deeply ingrained in colonial history, specifically in the way they work, or they continue to work today. They reinforce, you know, the global power dynamics in the global north and also in the global south. So how can we really think about then the institutional collaboration in a decolonial way when we are all, pretty much all of us, set in that particular context? Now, as you probably will notice, I will be kind of a interchanging between some very specific and very minor, sometimes very obscure or irrelevant almost, you know, like examples, and then kind of grander claims. So perhaps apologies for that. So to give you perhaps a very, you know, like a very small example, in the first part of our decolonial praxis project, we looked at a teaching, for example, and the curriculum. And we tried to see, we tried to look at how or what was decolonial in our, or what was decolonial in our approach in this project was that we tried to compare practices of decolonizing in different institutions. And the way we did that was that the colleagues of these institutions ran the assessment of the work and the evaluation of the extent to which, you know, their curriculum is decolonial. So basically, you know, in a sense that we said, well, it would be good to see what, you know, what is being, you know, how different curriculums in a particular area work across different institutions. Now, and then we went on and said, well, you know, the way we do it doesn't, you know, it doesn't matter. You know, you develop methodology and practice and assessment as it is best or most appropriate for your context. Now, I mean, as I said, this is, apologies, this is perhaps a very small example of a decolonial praxis, but it is a decolonial praxis nonetheless, because it does allow that individuals that have knowledge about their particular institution and that they have a very particular knowledge also of the framework and the context and what does it mean, what is even, what decolonization or decolonial curriculum mean in their context, that they were able to bring and mobilize that particular knowledge in the assessment of the curriculum. And then we compare that, apologies, not because we compare that not with an aim to come back with some kind of a, you know, universal picture, but really to only kind of begin to understand how we can perhaps, I'm really sorry. Sorry, I'm really clearly unwell and I just have a coughing fit. Excellent. So the way we did that was then also not trying not to then come up with a, you know, with a kind of a one plan fits all, but rather, you know, we were just trying to then exchange the best practice and what perhaps, you know, is a sign or an example of a decolonial work or decolonial curriculum in those institutions. Now, as I said, this is a very minor and a very simple example, and I'm probably making more of it than it actually is. But the point of it is that that we left the outcomes open. And that allowed that partners could develop different methodologies and different practices that really best fitted their context. And if we think and this became like a way of addressing the hierarchies and kind of the colonial power dynamics. Now, the second aspect, if we are then to think about how, you know, how these collaborations risk, replicating colonial power dynamics, or what we can do to, in a way, address them, is really to think about how we can, build projects in a way where, this kind of, in a way, openness in methodology can remain, can be preserved. So obviously this can be done through questions around, co-production of research or co-design of research, and not just of research itself or the research proposal, but also here also of the budgets, right? So co-production of a funding application, for example, is necessary, and the responsibility is here, I would say, very much on the side of a researcher. And I would say the researcher in the global north, because that is normally where the funding is actually located, and it's a responsibility of a researcher to explain or to highlight any specific requirements needed or missing in the application. So I think we need to give an example of the overheads, right? As well as I think Shigo also mentioned this. I think, as we know, Western UK institutions always claim overheads if allowed, but this is not always the case in the institution of the Global South, or the researchers, perhaps sometimes from the Global South institutions, do not feel comfortable to claim those overheads. And I think actually, if we are to think about how can we decolonize these institutional collaborations, I think that it should be the responsibility of researchers here to always remind or ensure that those overheads, for example, are put in the application, regardless of, and only as a second step, think about, okay, how much can ours, the overheads or the fund or the resources that are required on the other side, how much of that can we put in? So how are these dynamics then built into the structures of the institution? Of course, this is through the funding landscape, formalization of international collaborations, through promotions, like Mojiba said at the very beginning, through travel restrictions, through risk assessments, ethics. It's really hard to think of practices that is not impacted by colonial legacies at institutional level. But I think the key really is to what extent can we, in a way, challenge that, or do we have any agency? And I think we do. I mean, there is a significant agency that researchers have, that is in relation to their partners, in relation to their own institution. In particular, in relation to the institution, I think we need to learn about I think it's really important that the researcher learns about the processes for institutional research collaboration. Learn what is possible and what is not. Do not promise funding or transfer of costs before you're absolutely sure what might or what might not be possible, or learn about the process, what is entailed, the bureaucracy that comes with research projects, with international project partnership is immense. So researchers should really think about how they approach it, what they can negotiate to be reduced, or put pressure on the home institution to start changing some of these practices. There are funder and state laws, of course, limitations, but within that, there are ways in which universities can really reshape how they go about managing international research projects and partnerships. And universities have agency as well, in particular by streamlining the processes of research and financial management. Academics have agency in these dynamics, in how they build up projects, in the collaborations, in the co-production of work, like I said. Think about impact that the project or the timescale might have on your partners. There is agency in selecting the kind of work one does. There is agency in relation to the allocation of resources, agency in relation to the understanding of the context of research, understanding that universities do not all work in the same way as perhaps they do in the UK, and that partner researchers might be managing a number of other projects and university responsibilities, that they might not that they might not have a buyout, for example, like perhaps one has here. So in short, ensure that there is a fair distribution and fair access to resources, opportunities, and decision-making plans. This means co-developing, co-designing the proposals, methodologies, and budgets. And finally, like a word of caution. Do I have time for that, Megan, or am I over?
Oh, you can have a couple of more minutes.
Okay.
We'll kind of segue into the discussion after this.
Okay. I think what's a word of caution, and perhaps best practice I think, as I said already, like do the work on what your institution requires before you start a project. Learn about the practices. Do not promise what you can't deliver. And also engaged in that process. Like as researchers, we often think that we don't have to worry ourselves with administrative responsibilities or how to manage research projects. But actually, I think in this case we really should. And perhaps I think one of the key things that that we kind of also thought about was that one way of really challenging the international collaborations was really to reshape or challenge. I mean, we know that the way international universities build partnership is by looking at the rankings, right? So the way to really think about decolonizing these rankings is to challenge academic institutions' ranking and develop, like Africa-based ranking on the integration of local knowledges and attending kind of what the community's needs. So to actually have a very different sense of, kind of what the university, while still ranking, I guess, to an extent, but that does this really disrupt, how we think about university hierarchies. So yeah, that's also. Thank you very much, and apologies for a coughing fit.
Thank you very much, Andrea. So this does segue quite nicely into best practices and the questions of the relationship between individual agency and institutional structures, as well as drawing from Shego's intervention, the extent to which we can challenge institutional structures from our own standpoint as individuals and as collectives. So with that in mind, I'd like to open it up to discussion now. I know we have there are a lot of audience members who have their own experiences, good and bad, with international collaborations, and who might have important comments to contribute to the discussion. So I would invite questions from the audience as well as reflections that you might have. Please use the raised hand feature, and that way if we have multiple questions at once, I can call on you in order. But again, if you'd prefer to type your comment in the chat, feel free to do that and I can read it aloud. I would also invite the panelists, if you have questions for one another or comments on one another's interventions, please feel free to raise them now. Yeah, with that, I will open it up. Who would like to begin? Not, I will take the chairs per minute, which I was trying to resist doing. But there's so much, there's so many rich contributions to think about here, and I find myself feeling encouraged actually about the potential to challenge colonial dynamics through international collaborations, because there are so many like-minded critical scholars across the globe who who are eager to challenge those power dynamics. But I would like to return to this question of language, if that's all right. Shego raised the point in her intervention. Alison has mentioned more of that in the chat, saying that the research research manager at PUCC would have contributed an interesting perspective in relationship to Shego's reflections, many common points. But again, the language barrier made that difficult. So I would invite panelists and also audience members to say a bit more about the role of language in institutional collaborations. And on the surface, I'm referring to English language hegemony, but I'm also thinking about academic language, what is considered appropriate language for funding applications, the extent to which academics need certain terms to use to mean particular things and others to avoid because they might be uncomfortable for funders. What is the role of a particular way of speaking and writing in replicating colonial power dynamics, and how can we challenge that as well? Feel free to jump in. Yes, Njiba.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll be very brief. I think for me, there's two things that we have to really kind of think language. One material. And I think part of the okay, Megan, can you hear me?
I can now.
Megan, can
Yes.
you hear
Sorry.
me?
Yes. I can hear you now.
Okay,
I wasn't able to a minute ago. But I think turning the camera
yeah.
off does help. Thanks.
Yeah, so I've turned the camera off. Yes. So just to sum up, I think the first challenge that we have is our own level of uncomfortability, right? And we're uncomfortable often when we're in conversation with people who don't speak English. For example, you were at ASAA, right? And we saw that. So for those of us who are not familiar, I'm the treasurer of the African Studies Association of Africa. And our last conference, we had it in Cabo Verde. And Portuguese is the national language in Cabo Verde, right? So although the conference was in English, there was a lot of Portuguese, and you could see the level of uncomfortability, right, with engaging in Portuguese. One, and then many of us couldn't even engage in Portuguese. So I don't speak Portuguese. And so even the Portuguese speakers had to just struggle with their English with me, right? And I'm a horrible language person, but I do think that it's important for us to move beyond our uncomfortabilities and embrace perhaps having entire meetings in other languages and being the ones on the side of the interpretation, right? Whether it's in French, whether it's in Portuguese, whether it's in Swahili, whatever it happens to be. So I think that that's one thing, is we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And then the other thing I think is important that you mentioned, Megan, is a question of the language that we use for these proposals, right? It's very technical, it's very academic, and I think it is very much it's scripted, right? It's scripted for academics and grant writers in the global north. Like, let's be clear, right? And so the problem is that it's scripted for a group of folks who may or may not have the key to the script. But many people outside of Europe or America don't have the key to the script because it wasn't even scripted for them. So one of the things that may help us is finding ways to give the key to the script to people who are not in places in which the script is being developed. And let me also just say this before I close. Everyone in the US, in Europe, in wherever else, right? Like, we're not suggesting that all academics have the key, right? Oftentimes it's certain academics based on certain classes, based on their relationships to funders, based on the endowment of their universities. For example, in the US, historically Black universities and colleges are heavily underfunded. And many of the conditions that academics face at those institutions are similar to the issues that we face here on the continent, right? I taught for a year at Lincoln University. Research funding, very minimal, right? Pay, also minimal, right? Access to, major research grants managers or people who can write research for you. Research grants, very minimal, right? And so my kind of point is, like, we've got to open the key. And I think that's the challenge that we have. And let me just say this, I'll just say this last, and then I'll finish. I know I said last, but this is really the last. I think not only are we uncomfortable with language, but I think sometimes we're uncomfortable with giving up power and ego, right? And I'll give myself as an example. I'm co-writing an article with a couple of scholars who've been in the field for less time than I've been in the field. And, sometimes when they give ideas, sometimes you feel some kind of way, right? Because maybe you've been in the field longer, but then you've got to step back from feeling that way, right? And then recognize that your job as someone who's been in the field longer is not to curtail people's ability to be innovative and take the field to the next level. Your job is to mentor and to motivate and to promote, right? And to big up those folks who, speaking about language, right? And to big up folks who are, coming and working with you. And I think we also need to do that when it comes to international collaboration, is that we have to say, I can teach you how to do this and I can step back because I got the key. Let me give you the key, right? And so I think that's something. And then the last thing that I think is important, just this is just a side note around language and around self, right? Like I think oftentimes these international collaborations, like African people, we have to bring, like, as Du Bois says, like we have to live in a double consciousness, right? Like on the one hand, we can, engage with our colleagues one way and maybe speak pidgin and maybe, speak slang, or maybe, engage from a real cultural perspective. And then when we enter these international collaborations, we all of a sudden have to develop and fall into a new culture or a different culture in order to be taken seriously. Well, why won't you take me seriously just because I say, you know what I'm saying? Do you see, I still have a PhD. I've still written. I'm still intelligent. Me saying, you know what I'm saying, doesn't make me any more or less intelligent than anyone else in the world. And so I think even moving beyond this colonial understanding of language and who controls or who has access to language, right? Or who can change language, I think is important. So I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Najiba. Do we have other thoughts from speakers or panelists or members of the audience about the politics of language and coloniality? Andrea, jump in.
Yeah, sorry, I just decided to raise my hand. So I just want to kind of build up on what Madiba was saying in terms of like funding applications, right? I sometimes wonder whether actually we can also not just, one option would be to give the key, right, and then step back, right, to actually provide a way in which I suppose a kind of a training or, of how this can be, how of how to write successful or funding applications, how to use what languages is used. But then at the same time, actually, I wonder whether the best would be really to just challenge that this is not the way, applications need to be written. They can be written differently. They can be different ways in which knowledge is expressed, and different ways in which of how you can assess the quality of a research proposal. So I think that's the other way. I mean, I think it's more difficult because then of course you need to not only challenge the institution in which you're working, but the whole funding landscape, which I think obviously realistically I think that's a lot, but I think it is also a way of something that perhaps needs to be mentioned. And as for, in terms of the language politics, I think absolutely. I think we need to be, I need to be uncomfortable. We need to be on a side where we are being interpreted. And I think it would be wrong to assume that, the English should always be the main language of academia. I wonder, I mean, in terms of language politics, sometimes, although it's not really related, but I wonder if actually open access is perhaps more important than, well, it's not more important, but like the open access is equally important. Open access to research is equally important to kind of try to destabilize, try to at least open up those relationships to being more equitable. So I think open access research, I think, is really essential because I think if you are trying to work in decolonial context, have a decolonial project, and then, as we know, I mean, so Megan, Majiba, myself, and also Chris are currently working on a special issue, really. And one of the key questions for us is how do we, who do we approach so this to ensure that our the work that's being produced is going to be open access. And especially because if you approach the open access journals, of course, there is a certain amount of payment to it, right? So who will provide those resources, right? So I think then the question really should be also from the universities from the global north is, can they be, providing those resources that ensure that, the research that's being produced is open access.
Thank you for that, Andrea. Winnie, would you like to jump in?
Yeah. I'm just, I think just the current situation of AI, what concerns me with language is that in recent times, there is a lot of using AI. And apart from, of course, those templates where we write proposals are given, is not the template, is not the title that tells you the state of art or whatever it is telling you or whatever is listed, but is the content of what you will write. So I do know that with the AI, it can sometimes language can really disadvantage you. A colleague of mine once shared with me, who is a Kenyan and lives in Canada, and was saying that you cannot write an application that will go through if you have come from Kenya, if you've not at least interacted with a Kenyan who has been there longer or a Canadian to help you put the right keywords that will make you go through the first shortlisting. So I think this language thing is quite something we need to keep managing it. Of course, we always think of it in a very simplistic way, that is French, English, Kiswahili, but it's beyond that. Even just a context where all of us speak English, some of us started speaking it in our grade 1 or 2, and we continue to speak. Still, if I was to now put my English and the other typical English as a local language, I'm sure the other one there are variations. So how do we deal with those variations? And do the variations undermine, for example, scholars coming from other contexts, especially in terms of if you are submitting proposals? Of course, if the reviewers, there are some reviewers who are very sensitive to language. So the moment they see that this is a French person writing, they are very lenient. They won't get into, grammar will not, get you off marks. But there are some people who said, well, they said you submit in English, so it has to be English. This is not communicating. Because sometimes when you're not good in a language, you don't communicate. So I think these are issues that we need to continue discussing, but I'm more concerned about the recent times with AI, which is just complicating it even further. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you did raise the issue of AI. Like, as someone who recently led a hybrid bilingual workshop with human translators, that was an issue that several participants raised. The incursions of AI and really the ways in which AI replicates colonial power dynamics and the prejudices and inequalities of access to language that that are longstanding, but with the illusion of neutrality. So I'm glad that you brought that up, Winnie. Thanks for that. Shago, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to touch on what Winnie just said about language, even in the English context. I think, a few months ago, we were reflecting on how part of our role is to translate some of the language that's used by funders, particularly when it's written directly in a way that appeals to sciences and, health sciences versus humanities and social sciences, and having to translate that in order for people to understand what's required and what's needed and what they're looking for. Again, as Winnie said about the keywords to use and the key phrases to use in order to be competitive in that way as humanities and social sciences as well. Just a different dynamic on language.
Thank you for that, Shago, and everyone. Are there any other questions from the audience, or actually also from panelists to one another? Not immediately. I do have another question really about this theme of due diligence as it relates to global mobility. In the UK, there is a growing issue, problem, crisis, longstanding colonial practice involving visa regimes that make it very difficult for partners from the Global South in particular to access conferences and events in the UK. at the same time, there's, I think it was Shego who mentioned this earlier, but I think several participants alluded to this. The ways in which risk is framed is highly racialized and highly colonial. When researchers from the global north want to collaborate with colleagues in the global south. So this raises a broader question about the role of international mobility in constraining international collaborations and the ways in which assumptions about the way that people can or should or want to move are framed by visa regimes and by the government agencies restricting mobility. Would any panelists like to reflect on mobility and coloniality when it comes to international collaborations, whether that's in the form of assessments of perceptions of risk and due diligence or visa regimes? Winnie?
Yeah, I think, thank you for raising it, because we didn't get deeper into it, but it was just like we had too much to handle. Mobility is a big issue, because of the requirements of mobility. First of all, when you just look at what is expected, first of all, I also think that is an issue because of the power play. If the South had its resources and was opting for where to send students under their own conditions, I think it would be very different from when students are being invited and the British Council has given you resources, or the Ford Foundation or somebody else has given you resources, and you have to comply with whatever the necessaries. But even the countries, the foreign affairs ministries and the embassies that are out here. I know, like, for example, US sometimes it's just brave to tell people that you can't go and do that subject in the US. You can do it in Kenya. You can imagine that kind of statement, that's what you are being told at visa. Another typical example is I had my own daughter traveling to Costa Rica, United Nations University. So I looked at the rationality of how she would get there. And the cheapest for me and best was through Spain. So I went ahead and processed her to apply for a visa, because you need a transit visa. They don't reject it at the point of request. They let us wait for 10 days, 2 weeks. Then they said there are other ways to go to Costa Rica. That is what it reads in the visa. And then after that, we say, what next? Okay, now we go through South Africa. What does that mean? This child goes to South Africa, have to put her in an hotel, and then process the visa there, and after that, continue to go to Costa Rica via Brazil and Panama. You can just imagine. So this mobility can be so complex. Everything was ready. She was being waited for by the school, but just the hurdles of in between makes it very complicated. So I think mobility is a very good thing for our students. We must also put the positive side. I think is one of the best parts of collaborations that I really like. We have one with King's College London, and we have some with Denmark, and they've been very useful for students' engagement and having that, synergy, including facilities, library and everything, and also meeting, new friends and ideas. It's good, but the countries, I don't think this is done by scholars. Scholars have gotten very upset when they find that you have arranged a conference in Manchester, and then we can't come because somebody just decided not to give us a visa or made it so complex. So I think mobility, issues of visa are a big problem, where again, it is that deficit that is seen from the South, that one even doubts you when you have been admitted in a school. They still doubt whether you should come. So I have big problems with mobility, although I didn't talk to it, in terms of visa processing and related. And this is now not lying in academic institutions. I think this is lying in our countries and governments. And I know some universities that have even written appeals I've had experience with students where a university has written an appeal to their government, and sometimes it has succeeded to allow somebody come for a conference. But do we need to go through that? After you have struggled locally to go through the visa and go for an interview, even just to negotiate the internet to file you have so many things, even unnecessary things you are made to file there, which you don't even need to file. And then after that, you still have problems after you finish the filing of all that is required. And then it can follow with a rejection. After you've spent money, nobody even returns the money that you have used unnecessarily. So I think it's a big debate, a real demonstration of coloniality. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. That's infuriating. There's a comment in the chat from Allison who says, thank you so much for all of your reflections. My sense is that this conversation helps build our awareness, which may have impact on our conversations and decisions, and hopefully in our participation in creating different protocols and practices. I totally agree with you all regarding the replication of power differences that AI reinforces. It was helpful to hear about your specific examples. Regarding mobility, such an important topic, our university, this is the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, is rethinking the concept of exchange programs for undergraduate students. Doing a semester or a year abroad is unfathomable for most families here. So our university is now looking into creating professor-led short trips during the summer. Thank you all again for all of your examples. Thank you for that, Allison. Any other reflections on this question of mobility and its implications on the power dynamics of international collaboration? Jiba, over to you.
Thank you. And I'm going to keep my my comments short this time for real. And I'm going to keep off my my camera so that the bandwidth doesn't misbehave. So I think for me, I think one of the things that's powerful around mobility, I won't talk about the lack of mobility because we all know that. But I think when projects demand, particularly that mobility has to be, two ways, particularly for early career, academics and students, right? And so I think one of the ways that we can sort of get around these real power dynamics is by building into our relationships the ability to have two-way interactions when it comes to mobility. So for example, we at the Institute of African Studies have a relationship with the Erasmus program, primarily in Germany, but also in Italy. And we currently have two of our master's students in Italy, and two PhD students are going to Italy, and a couple of our master's and PhD master students have done the Erasmus program, and some of our colleagues. And I think it's a immensely impactful interaction and experience that they've had. But I think the only reason that it works is because we, are in collaboration with universities on that side that have clearly said we want to make sure that, there's two-way traffic. And that is something that we can push if we are doing grants, or if we're, having fellowship programs, that there's two-way traffic. The thing that burns me is when people get so excited and they come and they bring their students to Ghana and they expect us to jump and do everything, for them and give them a great experience, which we do. But then the very students who are giving other colleagues a very great experience, they also don't get an opportunity to experience that on the other side. And so I think for me, that when we talk about mobility, as much as older is not the right word, but more seasoned academics, I think is important for us to talk about the visa politics and all these things. I think if we start focusing on a two-way two-way exchanges and focus on early career faculty and new, and PhD and master's students, I think then we'll begin to break some of those barriers. So every time we write a project, we write in for students to go and study and do research under, say, myself, Megan, and whoever. We write a project and we're like, okay, we're going to exchange students for 6 months or 2 months, and that student would come and work with me in Ghana, and a student would come and work with Megan, right? So I think for me, that's something that we need to be thinking critically about as we're moving forward, particularly questions of mobility.
Thank you, Mujiba. It's helpful to hear of practical suggestions as well, of how to recognize the pitfalls of visa regimes and how to navigate them at an individual level. Andrea, would you like to come in?
Yeah, literally, as I was about to say, it's very similar to Mujiba, but to say that perhaps, I mean, of course, this is less of an issue of, well, it's not necessarily an issue of university, but much more about the state. But, at the same time, university, and I'm not, universities, of course, campaign, they have, they put pressure on the government on the visa for the students and stuff. But I think, I wonder whether actually more can be done around research projects, and if and that it is almost like a part of a research project that if that your collaborators should be allowed to come to the country, to travel, to exchange, so that this is not then the question of you will get a visa, will you not, what's going to happen, but rather that that being awarded a grant will automatically, mean that your collaborators can also, can come to, say, Manchester, and you can go to, wherever, like Ghana, for example, right? So that there is that, that exchange is continuously possible, and that it's not and uninterrupted, because also for a successful project, I think that that it's important that collaboration and exchange is not interrupted, right? Or dependent on, like whether or not one might get or might not get a visa. So I think it's also perhaps thinking about how to embed that, or where to push to perhaps ensure something like that.
Great. Yes, definitely. Thank you. We have time for about one more round of questions. I will invite Odile Masia to intervene now.
Hi, thanks, Megan. I work at the Global Development Institute as research manager, and I'm part of Shaker's project, the British Academy one. But just to mention that we're also in touch with other colleagues that have been awarded the British Academy project on international collaborations, on equitable partnerships in international collaborations. And just to echo the same thing, that there've been quite a lot of problems with visa, colleagues being denied visa despite being on a funded project, which, as Andrea said, that is obviously making the project very complicated right from the beginning. And it would be good that would be a prerequisite that if you get funding, you're a part of the team and you can travel. But as you said as well, it was mentioned before, sorry, it is also part of the government, the Home Office, and is that kind of raising our concerns collectively to try and change that, because it's really disruptive. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that from your experience, Odile. Shego, would you like to come in now?
Thank you. Yeah, just to also add in that, really great reflections around visa and mobility, because I think, it's stuff that we're learning and dealing with at the moment. And just to say that I think, as Odile mentioned, we're all learning from all of this, certainly from the project that I'm working on, which is meant to give feedback back to the funder about some of the challenges that research management has, and how do we build these collaborations, how these functions work. This is another bit of it that I think we can push back on, and certainly point out quite strongly about the challenges of having that mobility, which is really important, obviously, in research project, to feed it back, so that perhaps maybe there is some pushback, not just from researchers and institutions, but from funders as well.
Definitely. And I think returning to, I think, the theme of your presentation, there is it isn't all one-sided. So we're talking about institutional constraints and structural constraints, but we're also discussing the degree of agency that we have as members of institutions, as people with funded projects, and as individuals within a system to push back. So that's an important reminder that we can do that, and that we must do that. I mean, I will say from my own standpoint as a staff member at a British university, increasingly I struggle with the ethics of inviting international participants to come to the UK with the recognition that I'm going to expose them to the brutality of the British visa regime in doing so, because coming as an invited guest will require them to go through a long and expensive and really degrading visa application process in order to then come to the UK, spend money in the UK, bring knowledge and expertise to the UK. Ethically, does that make sense? Should we be bringing more expertise and more say wealth of knowledge and experience to the UK when Britain is not reciprocating, let's say, not extending the same hospitality and goodwill to scholars from other countries. That's not a question that has a clear-cut answer, but that is something that I'm struggling with at the moment. What are the ethics of international collaborations amidst the hostile environment? Shego, would you like to have the final word on this?
Thank you. Like you said, I don't think I have answers to this, but I do want to add in terms of my thinking around the ethicality of it, because there is a level of damage that happens when collaborators have to go through this brutal process of visas. And I think Odile and I, being in touch with other colleagues who've been funded by the BA who've mentioned all of these things, it's quite damaging and people stop engaging. And so while I don't have answers in terms of how, what to say about the ethics of it, it is a really big consideration, I think. Quite nervous about where we go from here in terms of, collaborations. If, people in the administration side are stopping to engage because of all of this. Some really hard questions being asked about why they were not given the visas and why they cannot, and we can move quite freely the other way.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad that you ended with that element of tension. We began with this tension of the importance of international collaborations for challenging colonial power dynamics alongside our active participation and commiseration with those power dynamics. And there are no easy answers. I think this discussion has given us a clear sense of what is being done to challenge those power dynamics, of what remains to be challenged, as well as raising the questions of our own role in that process. So let's continue to have these difficult conversations. Let's continue to commit to pushing against colonial power dynamics within institutions. Let's continue to recognize the importance of decolonizing higher ed in our own work and of working together in that process. Thank you all, everyone, for your contributions to the discussion. Thank you in particular, Shego, Jiba, Andrea, and Winnie for your interventions. Let's continue the discussion and best wishes, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening, and let's stay in touch. Thank you and bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.